Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Ashlee Vance, a reporter with Bloomberg Businessweek, and I am joined today by Will Marshall, the co-founder and CEO of Planet Labs. Hello, Will.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing all right. I think thanks for joining us on this chat. I think we're gonna keep exploring this topic of storytelling in climate change, and you're such a great guest for this because your company does some things that are pretty uniquely suited to this, particularly for people like me that are reporters, and then for companies and the world at large. I think we've got a couple slides, and I was going to kind of go to the first one to set you up here, which is some people might not have heard of Planet Labs and know what Planet does, which is what you guys do is pretty spectacular. Can you give us the basics of
Yeah,
of how your technology works?
absolutely. In essence, we've miniaturized satellites and put a lot of them in orbit, doing Earth imaging. So these are cameras, and they're in a polar orbit. And this little graphic shows, we call them doves, and we have about 150 in orbit. Each one is looking directly down, taking pictures. And they take a strip of pictures as they go across the Earth or in orbit. But there's a whole line of them, so that the next one takes the pictures just next to the previous one because the Earth is rotating underneath. So we've literally erected a line scanner for the planet. The system is in orbit. We've been launching it over the last few years, and we get down millions of pictures every day of basically mapping the entire landmass and nearby coastal regions of the Earth every day. We also have a second system of higher resolution satellites that can zoom in on any particular location, as this little graphic is demoing here. So, and why do we do all this? It's because the data is really relevant to a lot of applications here on the Earth, and I can talk a little bit about that. But it's really interesting how the space revolution has changed a lot. Space 1.0 was all about national pride and sending missions to the moon and Mars and science and exploration. And now it's so down to earth. It's about how we can help all the challenges facing the planet, not least sustainability.
Yeah, we can pull up the next slide just to show people the immense amount of data that you guys are pulling down. And just while people look at that, I mean, what's always struck me as amazing about your technology is that these images used to be incredibly rare, and now you guys are taking multiple photos of every spot on the Earth's landmass every day, and they're readily accessible to just about anyone at a relatively low cost. And just as I think about like storytelling with green technology and climate change, the one thing that's always struck me about what you guys do is that as a reporter, it was hard to like convey the sense of urgency sometimes about climate changes unless you were somewhere where it was like right in your backyard. You didn't. It was an abstract concept, and the scale of change was hard to convey. Tragically, it's especially for me here in California, it's a little easier at the moment. But you guys do give this visceral sort of picture of what's happening, and are able to. I think of you as like this real-time accounting system that monitors changes and lets people see that change take place.
Absolutely. And I mean, look, a picture speaks 1,000 words, as they say, and a satellite picture in particular, because it has global reach. I think the most interesting stat that's on this page is about 1,300 images for every place on the Earth. So we're just every day monitoring everywhere, and a deep stack of images showing and documenting change. All the ways humans are affecting the planet. And it's a vast array of ways we are. Actually, the next couple of slides show a few of those examples, just so people get a sense. But yeah, the pictures tend to tell what's going on. This was the Beirut explosion, and before and after, and seeing all the destruction. And this image was actually used by the rescue operators to help in the rescue operations and save lives. I think there's another one that shows the recent oil spill in Mauritius, and capturing that again to help the cleanup operations, and also, as you put it, make visible what is all abstract before, right? And we're doing that for the whole planet. And not everything can be seen from space, not your social media scandal or whatever, but a lot of stuff can. and we see the whole of it.
Well, and something like the oil tanker right there, I mean, in the past, because most of these satellites were controlled by governments or companies that had relatively few satellites, I mean, you would have had to have been very lucky to capture an image like that a satellite was pointing at that particular spot on that particular day, and it took quite a bit of money and effort to point a satellite towards that thing. But so in that example, I mean, you guys are you're already there capturing this sort of no matter what.
That's exactly right, and well, almost certainly you wouldn't have been able to get a satellite image before because it was focused on that nuclear silo in Russia or whatever the strategic thing that the different governments were trying to figure out about one another, and so there was barely anything for everyone else. Now there was the Landsat mission that NASA had that did some scanning, which was incredibly a workhorse of understanding land and changes, but at a lower cadence and so not as frequent, sort of every month, and not as high resolution. And we thought the higher resolution and frequency of month and daily enable us to get inside the decision-making loop of all the human activities around the planet. And that's what we're trying to ultimately do, is help people make smarter decisions down on the ground.
And I wanted you to you know, in this vein of storytelling, I wanted you to walk me through a couple of cases in detail, particularly in South America. You know, in terms of this idea of providing evidence and this real-time accounting system. I mean, I know, and you tell me, I mean, I think in Brazil, well, I've seen a number of news reports where, you know, deforestation happens and it's hard sometimes to prove it, right? But you guys have actually had court cases now and tons of reporting in the country around actually tracking how deforestation is playing out and holding people accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. So literally our data is used in courts of law in Brazil all the time to bring landowners to account if they've allowed deforestation on their land illegally. And this sort of thing is much broader. We had a case of some investigative journalists in Peru that were looking for why people were getting poisoned downstream in a river, and they looked upstream in our imagery, and there had been an illegal gold mine placed, and they were using some sort of poisonous material as part of the processing of the gold, and then that was poisoning people downstream, and only with our imagery could they see that illicit gold mine. And these stories, and that's, I mean, the planet is bringing those stories to life with the imagery. It's not only the only source of information, of course, often, but it really it brings home, and essentially we're shedding light on events all around the world, not just in the sustainability sense, like the couple of examples we've just given, but also in human rights, also in security. Peace and security. I mean, you know, a lot of the stuff to do with the Uyghurs, refugee encampments in China was brought to light through analysis of our imagery, where we found over 100 more sites that hadn't been discovered before. So yeah, that storytelling is hopefully a tool of great utility to the journalists around the world that are trying to understand what's going on, as well as to local decision makers.
And what's your feeling on how many people know about this type of technology? Like, if you know, sometimes you guys' images are used to show when North Korea is doing a missile test or something like that. And in my experience, I mean, there's maybe there's obviously a lot of people in the government who do this type of work, but as far as being like an open source, independent analyst, there's maybe like a dozen people on Earth who really know how to use this technology well. When it comes to climate and what's going on, you know, how many journalists know these tools exist? How many governments know these tools exist? How many regulators? I mean, it's still sort of early days in some ways, isn't it?
It is. But what we're trying to do very hard is make it easier to access. So not only bring about this amount of data that we're covering everything all the time, so you don't have to task a satellite, but rather also make it simple to use. And so we now have hundreds of journalists using our data and thousands of researchers. I mean, when you talk about sustainability, a lot of work is now being done based on our imagery. We do a lot of work, for example, with NASA on tracking key climate variables and how our data can help with that. We do a lot of work with hydrology. This example that's been brought up is, of course, really pertinent, how we can help with the devastating wildfires. And just this week, we launched a new system called the California Fire Observatory, trying to react to the challenge of the mega fires in California, which is also where our headquarters are. So it's a particular passion of ours as well. And here we see a fire. What we can do with our imagery is not only help the firefighters during the fire to detect where it is, which way is it going, but more importantly, perhaps, we can assess where's all the fuel for the fires to help mitigate that before fire season. So where's the fodder, where's the dead tree, where's the extra pieces that need clearing, or where the fire lanes needing clearing before the fire season. And so we really hope this will be a preventative tool. So the California Fire Observatory we launched just this week with our colleagues at Silo.ai and some of our research colleagues. And we hope to be able to expand that sort of thing to more and more people. As climate change hits, we're seeing more and more extreme weather events. It's going to go up, not less, not down, and fires, flooding, and so on. And if we want to manage them as smartly as we can, hopefully preventative in this case, but even if it's just reactive, our data can help with that as well, hopefully.
I mean, you guys have had cases where you've helped people actually like get rescued, right, out of some of these fires.
Absolutely.
Where it's like where the first responders just have outdated maps or you kind of don't know
Absolutely.
the terrain.
Yep, absolutely. That's happened a lot.
And
If you go to the next slide, it's actually a little, I think, this is just a quick picture of this California Fire Observatory I mentioned, which shows the wind speeds and also where, literally it counts every tree in the state of California and updates that on a frequent enough basis for the firefighters to know ahead of the fire season, hopefully, as well as that real-time fire assistance, as I mentioned. If you don't measure it, you can't do anything about it. So that's the first step. And satellite data, again, isn't a silver bullet to these things, but it helps a lot. And it can often be foundational. And so, yeah, and what we're seeing is a lot of work in the area of things like sustainable finance, which is, and there's a lot of work in geospatial sustainable finance, which is all about bringing geodata like ours into the mix to hold these things accountable and frankly to prop up that system, because without it, individuals like yourself won't be able to rely on it, and nor will banks, nor will governments, nor will civil society. So across the board, we hope that our data will be able to underpin that transition. And that's for the genuine do-good part of it, and it's because there's a multi-trillion dollar transition at the base there, which Planet hopes to tap into as an information feed to build a business case. And we think we can do the good and do well, so to speak, at the same time, and there's no contradiction there.
I mean, how do you imagine? What do you imagine this looking like in 5 years? I mean, does Apple put out its annual report with with pictures from someone like Planet that show actually where its money went? Like, are we close to something like that already? And how do you see this playing out?
With some of the most forward-leaning organizations, we are close, yes. And whether or not the pictures themselves go in or it substantiates things that are metrics that underlie, supply chain management is one of the things that all these companies are going to have to do to prove that their products do come from sustainable sources, just like people in the past have had to prove that their products come from sources that don't include child labor or what have you. We've got to account for that, and there can't be in that supply chain to IKEA or to Apple or to whomever else that unsustainable forest or that pollution of that river. And so we will be able to monitor that for people's supply chains, whether it's commercial or government. Yeah.
And what do you think we'll be able to track? I mean, your satellites are kind of fascinating because it's not just images. You guys have all these sensors on there that let people do things like look at crops, what farmers have planted, and you guys can even track, I think, kind of how much chlorophyll is in the plants. So
Yep.
when is a good time to harvest and when isn't. And so you have this ability to put these different things on the satellites that see the Earth in different ways. I mean, we're talking about maybe not just trees, right? But like methane and I mean, what do you imagine as being able to quantify from space over the next few years?
Well, right now, what we can see is all those land use and maritime use. The large-scale areas of the world we can track, large-scale phenomena. The big areas of the planet are on the land. 25% of it is agriculture, 25% of it is forest, just over 25% of it is desert. The first two of those, for forests and agriculture, you really want active management. And so we can help those. And then in maritime, which is washing ships activity, coastal activity, coral reefs, mangroves, all that sort of stuff. Again, it's huge areas of land. I believe as we get going, we'll get better and better data, more spectral bands that help with things like measuring methane or other greenhouse gas emissions. More resolution to be able to see smaller changes that matter, say, for example, urban growth in the wrong area or in a flood risk zone or what have you. That's something we're doing with the World Bank a lot in Africa right now. And finally, higher frequency. So we're doing daily today of the whole landmass of the planet. We have a tasking system that can go up to 10 times per day, but generally, most areas are once a day. For some phenomena, like agriculture, that's plenty frequent enough because people just need the data in the crop growing season to improve crop yields and have sustainable agriculture. In other cases, like vehicle movement, you want it more frequent. And so as we get more frequent, it will be able to help that more actively. But let me also say that, it's not just about climate. And I think this land use piece really touches on, I think, a personal passion of mine, which is that it's so much about, I think the key thing that we need to be paying attention to is biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And here, there was this report that came out just last week from the World Wildlife Fund, which basically said we've lost 68% of the wild animals on the planet. And that is being driven in part by climate change, but actually that's the third biggest driver. The first biggest driver is land use change. That's mainly changing prime forest into agricultural land. And the second biggest is overfishing. And only the third biggest is climate change. So climate change is a forcing function of biodiversity loss. And we really care ultimately about the life on the planet, not the atmosphere of the planet. We care about the atmosphere as much as it's affecting the life. But this biodiversity loss is being driven by land use change. And that's the thing that, if you look at that UN report that came out last week on this, from the Biodiversity Convention, the first 4 of the 8 recommendations are all to do with land use. It's like, how do we manage the forest? How do we get more sustainable agriculture? How do we manage our fisheries better? And actually, how do we change our diet, which is interrelated to all of that, towards more plant-based, less meat-based diets, because that's the way we can individually contribute to a more sustainable planet. But all of that relates to land use change, and we're trying to draw attention to that. And let me end also on that little rant, if you like, with that there's some personal decisions that people can make to help that as well. Like I was mentioning about changing diet, wasting less food, flying less, voting for environmentally friendly politicians. And it's not much sacrifice to do those things, and they make meaningful impact to these challenges. So you've got to approach it from the top down with things like satellites and helping big companies and government. But we also have to approach it from the bottom up with people making personal changes to their lifestyle. And I'm optimistic because after COVID, we've seen people change their lifestyles really dramatically. And we're not asking people to all stay at home forever, but fly slightly less. And we're not asking people to radically, completely give up and change their diets, but we're asking them to eat less meat. And we're asking them to vote for those politicians. It's not much of a sacrifice to make for a big change to the planet to keep the rest of the species around.
I mean, it is awful all the way around. Well, and I'm just keeping an eye on time. If anyone wants to ask questions, please shoot them off. I mean, it's awful all the way around between the pandemic and the obvious effects of climate change that we've seen here, you know, especially on the West Coast, people in California and Oregon and Washington. But I mean, to your point, it's strange that like already the stress of the pandemic, at least for me, as the climate change stuff came along, I don't know, to me at least, there is this feeling of like, wow, it just became so obvious in this moment, in this year, that that things had sort of changed. I don't know if you've felt the same thing or what.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's become far more well understood. I mean, we've been seeing it for years. It's very transparent from space. Humans are messing things up, but now it's become much more obvious to our daily lives, and I think it's great that it's come to that really to everyone's attention. I can happily talk about the NGOs and non-profits, absolutely. So we partner with many non-profits, both education research institutions and NGOs that use our data for various projects. Let me give you an example. We did one last year where we were mapping all the world's coral reefs in collaboration with the Vulcan Institute and a bunch of university partnerships. And the first time classifying all the coral reefs around the world. There's many projects like that. In fact, this California Fire Observatory was also supported by a foundation, the Moore Foundation, and we continue to work with many nonprofits around the planet, and we want to do more in that area. If there's other questions, yeah, paste them in. That's great.
And like, how does it work in terms of paying for the images if you're an NGO or a nonprofit?
Yeah, so with education and research organizations like universities, we actually have a scheme where they can buy as a department or as a university, and it's very much reduced rates to try and enable those universities to get access. We have thousands of researchers. With the NGOs, it's sort of on a case-by-case basis, depending on the scale of their project and so on. We at least like to make our costs covered because it still costs us a lot to just migrate data and things like this. But actually, we've made a fair bit of revenue from it because these are important questions with important value propositions to the world, and people in philanthropic organizations recognize that.
You know, so I mean, I've known you personally for quite a long time now, and so I know that even before you guys started Planet several years ago, that, you know, this isn't just talk. I mean, climate change has been a big deal for you personally. I was kind of curious. I mean, just the fact that you're like surrounded by these images all day, this is like top of mind for you. Sometimes it's really depressing. I mean, I was kind of curious if you've come out of this, you know, more optimistic or more pessimistic as time has gone on.
That's a great question, Ashlee. I mean, I'm personally absolutely an optimist. Even during this COVID situation, and as tragic as it has been, and the current environmental mess that we're seeing in California, the fact is that we now have more tools at our disposal to address those things. And the silver lining for COVID is that we, as I was mentioning before, have changed our behavior dramatically. Look, flying just went massively down, and we already saw quick ecological benefits of that. And the same with, you know, there was a funny Gary Larson cartoon the other day. It was showing like people walking past animals in their cages was 2019, and 2020 it's animals walking past humans in their cages in their homes. And you're like, nature's come back, and it bounces back really fast, you know. Just to address this question about sustainability of storing our data is always stored on Google Cloud, and they, I think, have offset their cloud in terms of environmental offsets. I certainly understand that.
Yeah, I think Google actually put an announcement out this week about being kind of the most aggressively offset data centers in the world. Well, Will, we're just running out of time, and so thank you very much for joining us and telling us what's going on. And I know if people want to hop onto the Planet website, there's tons more images and information about some of the stuff that we talked about. And so thank you for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us.